The next talk will be by Dar'ja Zueva from St. Petersburg Humanitarian University of Trade Unions, the digital therapy of pain, the representation of experience of grieving in the narrative of that dragon cancer. Can you hear me? I'm happy to greet you. Just a second. I will share my slides. Today I want to talk about the digital therapy of pain and how it can be organized in gaming. Normally, the therapy of pain is thought to be the domain of psychotherapy because it cannot be translated into a binary code. But today I'm going to talk not about the medical help or not about psychotherapeutical help, but about the experience living through painful moments. How is it organized? Yesterday, we had a few interesting talks about ego representation, and Moriman's post-mortality's theory shows that the pain can be alienated and attributed to the character. And we can work with this representation. For example, it can be done through the space of digital cultural artifacts, the narratives of which will reveal different practices of living through the pain. But it is possible under the condition that they are aimed at a more careful and caring representation of the pain. It can be reached if the game characters have the chance to cancel their action, to restart the game, to reclaim the control that can be lost in a more spontaneously organized reality. There is a limitation hidden here too. So a subject, through ego representation, interacts with the space, with these narratives that are created intentionally and can interiorize his or her own painful experience. The digital therapy of pain can work with different kinds of painful experience. For example, disease. But in this small research, I want to focus on the digital therapy of pain related to grieving, to loss. And there are a number of reasons for my choice. First of all, the discussions about death in everyday discourse and academic discourse is not exactly tabooed, but marginalized. Death is a painful topic, and at least in Russia, we still see the practices of silencing the topic of death. But death is introduced into the realm of objects of studies, what emerges are death studies and digital studies. But we have to admit that in the Russian academia, there are just few authors who work with the topic of death. As for the public discourse, it evolves around violent death, euthanasia, abortions, some emergency kinds of deaths. And the discussions have either the legal character or religious character. If we try to generalize the experience of pain to the situation that may be relevant for everyone, if we try to find the general painful points for everyone, sooner or later we'll reach the topic of death. And thus we see the paradox. On the one hand, we see that this discourse is silenced, and on the other hand, it is maybe one of the few events which will concern everyone. We have to include here reflection on the topic of death. Death is present in the discussions outside of kind of calendar-based practices. The example would be, for example, memory events are spontaneously gathered on Zoom online. But I think that Tony Walter from University of Bath said a key thing, dying and grieving continually evolve, new preparations for dying, new kinds of funerals, new ways of handling grief, and new ways to memorialize are developing all the times. And this transition includes a lot of individual choices. It presupposes the active role of the subject. And the death is understood is not just attributed to someone, happening to someone, but also as one's own future experience. And taking this into account, we can set two directions of the digital therapy of pain, experiencing somebody else's death through the narratives of the cultural artifacts which reveal this topic, and the game experience as a way of self-care, as a way of decreasing anxiety, lowering the anxiety. So the goal of my work was to try to consider the therapeutic potential of that dragon cancer. This game was released in 2016 by Ryan and Amy Green. It is based on real events from their lives and their son Joel, who was diagnosed with incurable cancer, brain cancer, when he was 12 months old, and he died in 2014. At the Game Awards, the father, Ryan, made a heartbreaking presentation saying that they wanted to preserve the memory about the deceased son and somehow try to understand the tragedy they faced and maybe help other families that are one-on-one with the grief. Now I'm going to talk through the specifics of the game and show its therapeutic potential. The dragon cancer cannot be called a game in the literal sense of the term because it breaks the stereotype about the game space as the space for emotional and intellectual release. This is a way of talking about the most difficult things. There is a narrative to the game, and the game has set a number of ways of interacting with the environment. And it shows how hard it is to face this real life situation, that it is difficult to influence these processes, and how inevitable the end is, because whatever actions the player does, the ending will be one and the same. I think it is very important here to explain why they chose a game as a media and not film or any other genre of arts. It is related to the action-based experience of grieving and loss. This kind of active approach, many researchers, including Sergei Mohov, who has been researching ritual practices, he compares a game with the practice of DIY funerals, which was practiced in different villages of Russia. So people were engaged into planning their own funerals, and it helped them go through this experience, reclaim this experience, make it their own. What doesn't change here is not just the environment, but also the space of actions of every player. And what is introduced here are the inner limitations of therapy, because a subject immersed into such a carefully crafted space can get used to the limited range of actions they do, and they can fall into the illusion of false control, though in the reality, everything happens much more randomly. the characters in the game do not have their faces, so this is why the characters are not personalized and you can associate yourself with the characters. But of course, you can guess the images of Joel's father and mother in them. There are documentary materials too in the game, photos, um, parts of the diary of Ryan and Emmy, which personalizes the experience of grieving. These documentary artifacts are given at the end of the game through for us to find out more about the actual story. Another part of the game is cancer. Cancer is the only NPC which is present in almost all episodes. It doesn't almost act, and we don't act on it. It reminds one of an environment, peace environment element. At the same time as the disease is visualized, the game allows us to approach this experience that not everybody encounters in their life. For example, it tells, it explains what chemotherapy is, what palliative care is, how hospitals are organized, and what interactions are involved during hospitalization and after the death of the child. So basically what experience both parents and children go through. The next stage is immortalistic reflection. At some point we understand that the kid won't survive, and we see the parents explaining what they think is going to happen to their son after death. And on one hand, we can see the Christian mother and her religious hope. And in the game, it is shown that she uses this support from the religion. It is she who tells the story of Lazarus. She tells the story as a consolation for her husband. And we can see the father, atheist, who is drowning in despair. And a small spoiler, at the end, the father will reach the Christian understanding of post-mortal life, which saves him. And I see it as a drawback of the game, I think. There is no representation of a secular approach to post-mortal reflection, which I think is very important. The secular approach, the secular reflection is absent because it seems that the religious reflection is the only way of living through the pain. The only episode, while this a secular position is represented, is the baby night episode, where the father and the kid play as knights, dressed as knights, and the father is trying to reach the same goal as the game itself. It's a kind of a digital therapy of the dying boy. And as the father says, the father of Joel, why he chose the format of a game to preserve the memory about his son and didn't make a film or didn't write a book, he said that the game is this way of communication that they used with his son. And it was their kind of natural language. So why I'm focusing on this small game, mini game inside of the narrative? There is no threat there. There are no threatening factors in the small game. It is completely a separate, non-threatening kind of setting. And thus, the father shows us how he takes care of the son and finds consolation for himself. Here are some conclusions that I would like to draw. despite the fact that a digital therapy of pain has a lot of potential in the dragon cancer, but we also have to understand how limited this method is when a human being finds himself or herself in the situation of traumatic, painful experience. If he or she wants to go through therapy, they have to understand that this kind of ego representation, this kind of projection is limited. And I wanted to remind you of the illusion of control that can emerge for the player here and that can be incompatible with what the players see in their real life. Of course, the question about the proven efficiency remains open here. We need to turn to statistics, including medical statistics. So this is why the only goal I set here is to set the potential, to set the existing potential. And then the next steps will be turning to statistics. I would like to finish with the same thing I started with. What is existential experience as pain? It cannot be digitalized at this stage, but through interacting with caring narratives, we can decrease its destroying potential. This is all for me. Thank you very much for your attention. I kept it short. I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much, Daria. I can see Ksenia raising her hand. So, Ksenia, I will pass you the mic. You're welcome. Thank you very much. A really interesting talk. I have two questions, which are quite short. First of all, Daria, do you know the game called Grace, which is also about a girl, I mean, the main character of the game living through a traumatic experience? Maybe you know that game and you could say a couple of words about that. And as for the dragon cancer, my question is, this therapeutic game, I mean, who is the target audience? Who goes through the therapy? Players or the father and mother of this kid? I mean, the creators, the authors of the game. So when does therapy take place? In the process of game design or in the process of gameplay? Thank you very much for your question. The first question, unfortunately, I know this game very little. I know that it exists. I've heard about it. I I don't know if it's based on a real story because my research is mainly in postmodal reflection. So this is why I was interested in this game, The Dragon Cancer, because it has this real life story, which is shown as realistic as possible, which is shown which is represented. So I can't really talk in depth about that game, that other game you mentioned. As for the therapy and who goes through therapy, I think this game is an interesting case precisely because of that. I think it works as therapy both for the creators, for the authors, when the authors were trying to rethink this story, were trying to organize it, were trying to make sense of it. And it supported them through the difficult period in their lives. But on the other hand, this task itself of helping the other is built into the narrative of the game. So I think it can be therapeutic for anyone. Um, I mean, I think any human being in his or her reflection, thinking about the death of himself or herself or their close ones, their kids, their parents, can turn to this narrative because it's built in a very caring manner and it shares real practices that people can meet. For example, what is palliative care, how hospitals are organized. So this can help with the feeling of loss, feeling of lack of understanding. Okay, then I have an additional question. If we consider these games as a kind of therapy, do you think we can suggest this therapy for non-gamers, for those who don't do games normally? In my experience, as a non-gamer, as a user of a very, so to speak, initial level, I must say that the mechanics of the game is very clear, very understandable, and the game is very similar to what happens before the game. These educational introductions. The path of the character is very clear. You can go back to some of the episodes, you can go through them again. The mechanics is quite simple. There are no difficult tools in them. So I think it can be accessible to any user. Thank you very much for your answers. Any other questions from the audience? You were talking about secular forms of immortalism. Did I get it right that you mean such ideas like you will live in the bodies of others you helped? Yeah, including all of these ideas. I mean, secular ideas can be also different. Sometimes it's about continuing to live in one's kids or in your deeds, in your projects, or a kind of a sustainable or eco-centered concept that a human being keeps being part of this environment, but in a different form. I mean, there are different approaches to immortalism. They don't have to be related to religion. Thank you very much. Have you considered other forms of therapy? I mean, um, therapy concerning other problems. This is what I mean, like mm, the loss of a partner or falling out of life or separation with a partner. I read somewhere that in our culture there are very few narratives who train the people who somebody falls in love with to react in, because we have a lot of romantic stories um, about you falling in love without any mutual response, and people who experience it from the other side I feel guilt because it's like they cause suffering to others and they cannot get rid of that feeling of guilt. So I wanted to introduce this point just as something to discuss. Have you thought about the potential of this therapy for other issues that people may encounter? Thank you very much for your question. As for mutual love, I cannot really quote any examples here. I don't know any cases of unrequited love, but I think that this kind of therapy can deal with a number of cases. Most often, it is related to really traumatizing events like violence. Such games do exist. I will write in the chat in a second a title of the game which I encountered. It was designed by the center, by the Austrian Center for Support of People who went through domestic abuse. It helps them overcome it. In general, basically, this digital therapy deals with love, deals with trauma which cannot be digitized, but suggests some of the situations which can be played through in the format of a computer game. So I think that the potential is huge, really. We can work with different kinds of pain and grieving.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very
Есть ли
much.
вопрос еще у кого-то?
Any other questions?
Ну, тогда я, по всей видимости, задам еще. Ну, раз правильно я
Then
понимаю,
if that's okay, I will
информация
ask
по
another
метрике, по сравнению
another
с ошибками,
question.
когда ты должен
Do
пересмотреть
I
эту
guess
ситуацию,
it
это
right
все-таки
that it
основной
works
мотив, соответственно, в
like
твоих
the method used
экспериментах?
for
Потому что снова,
PTSD?
снова, когда оказываешься в той же
The
ситуации, когда
problem with
начинаешь переживать
PTSD is
снова
that you
это,
get
или
obsessed with a
вот
traumatizing event you
так
went
понимаю,
through
что
and you go
действительно
through that in your
возвращаться
head
туда же,
over and over again,
это все-таки не из дома,
and
мозг опять начинает заново это прокручивать у
the
тебя.
brain makes you
И
relive this experience.
в связи с этим даже такой вопрос, не получается ли, что в
So
игре
my question really
то же
was,
самое? То есть почему, если это делать в игре,
doesn't the
то это
game force you to do
не
the same
возникает такого
thing? I
чувства, что
mean,
мы
if it
все-таки
happens in the
пережили
game, if we go through it again,
или,
why
или,
don't we get
или
this
нет таких здесь
re-traumatizing
нюансов того,
effect?
что игра это тоже
Or
своего
and
рода
is
такой
there
внешненный
any
опыт,
danger that the game
эксперимент.
will re-traumatize people? That's true that this therapy is based on returning control. PTSD emerges from the experience of lack of control very often. And here we see an attempt to return the control, to reclaim the control in the space of the game. And it mentioned it that there are a lot of limitations here, of course, and this is yet an open question about whether these methods are efficient. But since we don't have anything else, any better options, we can consider it too. Here, the idea is that players are active, they do actions, they're in a proactive position, and this is why it can be therapeutic for them. In this game, the ending is one and the same, and the only narrative that the game suggests is coming to grips with the situation, learning to live with the loss. So I think that in general it is possible, but still it is a framework which has to be researched more.
Хорошо, спасибо большое,
Okay, thank
Дарья.
you. Thank you, Daria.
Что появилось, у нас есть время для одного маленького вопроса буквально.
Any other questions? We have time for one short,
Окей. Ну, хорошо, тогда, я
small
так понимаю,
final
что пока
question.
сейчас вопросов нет. Я
Okay, it
еще раз
seems like there are no
повторяю, Дарья, спасибо
questions
большое
in the
за
chat.
интересный
So, Daria, thank you
доклад.
very much
И я
again
думаю,
for an
что мы
interesting
можем
talk. And I think we've
отправиться
deserved a
на
break.
небольшой